But, I'm heartened by what you said about the, you know, people moving away from race as a proxy in medicine and science. And, the news is kind of a bad way of gauging what trends actually are, because you're only going to get bad news and you're only going to get, the salacious stuff. But I think there is this alarming propensity that people have, and it's informed by the culture and the discourse around these topics, where race seems to be forwarded as not just a proxy, but the proxy, the way to, determine whether this person versus this person should get certain medical care. Like these people go to the front of the line based on race and things like that. There was a case in New York City regarding COVID treatments that FAIR was involved in, which used race as a proxy for prioritizing this scarce COVID medication, right? There wasn't enough. And so because there wasn't enough, we're gonna just decide that race is a factor, is a precondition, a comorbidity. And we're going to use that, which would eventually kind of, somebody who's relatively healthy like me and relatively young um, would get bumped up to the front of the line instead of someone who's racialized as white and is, much older and maybe overweight and has other,
High
issues
risk.
that would
Yeah.
contribute to a much harder time with something like COVID. So I wonder how aware you are of that and what we should do there.
Yeah, I love that example because it invites us to consider, I don't know if they're just two sides, that's probably reductive, but at least two dimensions of, what you're bringing up. One is the almost sort of reactive attempt to, I don't know, again, level the playing field or
Right.
turn the tables so that those who are discriminated against suddenly get privilege. If that's going to be done based on something that we think is essential to those people who are racialized this way and their makeup, that's a huge mistake, as you say, because you and I, even on the screen, we look different in terms of the shades of brown that we are. We might be pushed to the head of the line, and you might be genetically so different than I am that you don't belong in that line at all. Like you might be,
Right.
Somebody who doesn't get COVID, whereas I might be somebody who is a bit more susceptible. So that's one thing that's problematic about it. On the other hand, if we start to see this thing that is referred to as race as circumstance versus corporeality, something that is bodily, then we can say, wow, people who are in X, Y, and Z circumstance tend to fare worse or better when it comes to this or that. So folks who are racialized as, I'll just say, white, through the COVID pandemic, seem to be getting greater access to treatment or medicine or seeing doctors or whatever than others. And there are other things in there too: location, transportation, social capital, all these things that redound or don't redound to being able to navigate systems. If we can look at circumstance, and then make decisions about how we try to allocate social resources, that's a more valid thing to do, it seems to me. There will be overlap in terms of circumstance and how people look because we discriminate, very heavily on how people look. But we ought to stop short of falling into essentializing people and saying that because Carlos and Angel are quote unquote Black, they should go to the head of the line.
Which is what the media ends up doing, actually, because I remember the story, Angel, and when it was reported that way, that Black people are more likely to get COVID in New York City. So this is an example of some sort of environmental racism. What it looks like, if you dig deeper, is that people of color generally were the ones working during COVID, like when everyone was at home and they were able to work from home. People still needed their food delivery. People still needed, groceries. And so it was kind of more of a proxy for social class than anything, but it kept getting reported as race. And similarly, many immigrant types, right, in New York City live in multi-generational homes versus white people tend to live in more nuclear. They're a bit more isolated from their grandparents, for example. And so the spread among these population was different, and that was more because of living arrangement than something else. But these stories get coded and talked about and reported as if this is a disease that is plaguing people differently based on race. And that's kind of the impression that, that it gives forth. And that's why I think when New York City tries to allocate drugs efficiently, they think that doing it by race is the best thing to do.
Mm. Yeah, and again, the good intention there, could be pretty easily, I think, sort of rooted in better science, better logic. And we might come up with some of the same outcomes, I'm not sure, but we wouldn't necessarily be, what is the word, recapitulating, this
Right.
idea of essentialized qualities that make people do this or do that, or inferior or superior, etc. Because that's what happens. I am waiting for a minute, where I can draft out what I guess would amount to like an APA style guide around how journalists should talk about race.
That'd be great.
Because you're
yes,
quite right.
That'd be great.
The portage of it, is still sort of stuck in. It's okay, to say that the Black person, the white person, the Asian person, and there might be circumstances, under which that makes sense. But the way it's used now is just so willy-nilly, and it just reinforces this notion that, it's because they are this, that this is happening, versus circumstances that they're part of, etc.
I love your distinction there between the race itself and the circumstances that race is used as a proxy for. And it seems to me that pretty much with anything, I can't think of anything that you shouldn't do this with. Instead of using the proxy, just go straight to the circumstance. Right? I mean, like people talk about this all the time with if you just try to address poverty, for example, you will disproportionately give aid to people who have historically been marginalized and oppressed. And they're in that circumstance for historical reasons of racism and all that sort of stuff. But you're doing it in a way that addresses the circumstance instead of this crude way of a proxy for the circumstance, because I don't really need any aid. I'm not poor, right? So you're wasting your time and energy on me. You should give it to somebody else. And even if that guy looks like Casper the Friendly Ghost, I don't care. He's poor. Help him.